by the explosion of the first, then hardly any living and breathing organisms would have remained on the planet. For weeks after the accident, scientists and engineers did not know whether the explosion of the radioactive Chernobyl volcano would be followed by even deadlier ones. It was not, but the damage done by the first explosion will last for centuries. The half-life of the plutonium-239 that was released by the Chernobyl explosion and carried by winds all the way to Sweden is 24,000 years. Pripyat is sometimes referred to as the modern-day Pompeii. There are clear parallels between the two sites, but there are differences as well, if only because the Ukrainian city, its walls, ceilings, and even the occasional window pane are still basically intact. It was not the heat or magma of a volcano that claimed and stopped life there, but invisible particles of radiation, which drove out the inhabitants but spared most of the vegetation, allowing wild animals to come back and claim the space once built and inhabited by humans. There are numerous marks of the long-gone communist past on the streets of the city. Communist-era slogans are still there, and inside the abandoned movie theatre, a portrait of a communist leader. Vita, our guide, says that no one can now tell who is depicted there. But I recognize a familiar face from my days as a young university professor in Ukraine at the time of the catastrophe. The painting is of Viktor Chebrikov, the head of the KGB from 1982 to 1988. It has miraculously survived the past 30 years, undamaged except for a tiny hole near Chebrikov's nose. Otherwise, the image is perfectly fine. We move on. It is strange, I think to myself, that Vita, an excellent tour guide, cannot identify Chebrikov. She also seems at a loss to explain the signs saying meat, milk, and cheese hanging from what was once the ceiling of an abandoned Soviet-era supermarket. How come, she asks, they write that in the Soviet Union there were shortages of almost everything? I explain that Pripyat was in many ways a privileged place because of the nuclear power plant, and that the workers were better supplied with agricultural produce and consumer goods than the general population. Besides, the fact that there were signs saying meat or cheese did not mean that those products were actually available. It was the Soviet Union, after all, where the gap between the image projected by government propaganda and reality was bridged only by jokes. I retell one of them. If you want to fill your fridge with food, plug the fridge into the radio outlet. The radio was telling the story of ever-improving living standards. The empty fridge had its own story to tell. It was on my trip to Pripyat that I decided I had to tell the saga of Chernobyl. It would be for the sake of those who were not around at the time, but who wanted to know and understand what had happened on that fateful night of April the 26th, 1986, and in the days, months and years that followed. Despite the Soviet government's initial efforts to conceal the Chernobyl disaster and downplay its consequences, it became well known in the Soviet Union and in the West, and received a great deal of public attention, starting with journalistic reports filed in the first days after the explosion, and ending with documentary films, feature movies, non-fiction investigations, and novels. Although the key to understanding the causes, consequences, and lessons of the disaster is historical contextualization and interpretation, few historians have addressed the subject to date. This book is a work of history. In fact, it is the first comprehensive history of the Chernobyl disaster from the explosion of the nuclear reactor to the closing of the plant in December 2000, and the final stages in the completion of the new shelter over the damaged reactor in May 2018. As I embarked on my research of the history of Chernobyl, I was helped enormously by the recent opening of previously closed archival collections dealing with the disaster. Many government archives opened their doors more widely.